Welcome back. We're continuing our focus on COP27, the Climate Change Summit in Egypt. Now, this is the first time it's being held in Africa. Africa holds 60% of the world's arable land. But as we know, this continent is extremely vulnerable to climate change, with the impact of droughts and flooding already being felt painfully. Let's look at the question, what does climate justice mean? We talked to Climate Justice Project Manager at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation South Africa, Dr Roland Ngam. Dr Ngam, thank you for being with us. For a long time, there has been a sense that the industrialized rich nations caused most of the problems and they should compensate the victims, usually African nations. Is that what climate justice means?
Yes, certainly. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, global warming really has been accelerating, and this has been caused by the really highly industrialized nations, the USA, France, Germany, China, and so on. And so these countries, which have caused a lot of what we are seeing now, the floods that we saw in KwaZulu-Natal, the Horn of Africa had serious drought issues this year. And all these things are happening in countries that contribute very little to global CO2 emissions. Africa, let's remember, contributes only about 3.9% of annual CO2 emissions. And so Africa really needs to be compensated for loss and damage.
As far back as 2009, rich nations pledged, it was $100 billion annually then to help developing countries or those in trouble. Our environmental minister says that has never been met once. We only got close once. That's incredible.
Yes, certainly. And this is really what UNEP says earlier this month, that there is no credible path to 1.5 degrees warming, no credible path. Not a single country around the world really has transitioned completely to a green economy. And China, which is the biggest polluter, has increased its coal power stations. Europe, which last year was talking about keeping it in the ground, is also going back to coal following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so the countries that have been behaving badly continue to do so. And they refuse to commit to honor the pledges that they themselves committed to in previous COPs. So COP really has been a lot of talking and talking.
So this time we'll have to see if it's different. Our government is going in saying more money is needed, and it's also about the just transition to renewable energy. How would that work? Does this do the funds come in the form of loans? We know that the World Bank, for example, is giving money to Eskom to turn Komati power station into a renewable energy station, because there's also more and more talk of loss and damage compensation, which would be giving nations money, saying we've done this in the past, this is a grant for you.
A lot of the $8.5 billion being offered to South Africa is concessional and non-concessional loans. Very little of this money is coming in the form of grants. I think only about $40 million in the first chunk of money that has been given to South Africa is in fact grants. But at COP27, African countries are going to insist that the money that comes to the continent should be for loss and damage. South Africa included needs to receive money in the form of grants. Otherwise, many African countries, which are resource-rich, which have a lot of gas deposits and coal as well, will continue to pollute, to develop. It is only fair that these countries are allowed to develop. And so, if we want to avert a situation where we're burning more dirty fuels, then we need transfers of clean technology from developed countries to developing countries.
And are African nations standing together on this? Is their case very strong that they're presenting this time?
Yes, last year, developing countries pushed for loss and damage, and there was a lot of disappointment when COP26 ended. This time around, developing countries are a lot more determined. They show that determination in Bonn earlier this year. And in Egypt, they are still going to be insisting that loss and damage should be top of the agenda. Otherwise, the resource-rich countries, South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria, all these countries that have a lot of gas, if you do not give them the clean technologies that they need to develop, these countries are saying, well, we are going to use what we have at our disposal.
You raise such an interesting point because people have looked back. So some of these rich nations were industrializing way before any African nation. They were polluting the air way before we started doing that. So they had time to recoup the benefit of that or to make the money, to be frank. So is it fair to say, yes, we actually now need a turn to pollute? We need that chance, unless, like you say, the compensation for that is enough to say, okay, let's give up those plans and do something else.
Well, this is really a fair argument. Africa really has about a population of about 1.3 billion now, and many African countries really are struggling. If you go to a country like Mozambique, which has received a lot of money now for gas projects, which a lot of which is going to be exported anyway, the gas projects in Mozambique now are far bigger than the country's GDP. And these countries need to take care of water, education, health, housing, and so on. And you have seen the difficulties that came with the COVID pandemic in South Africa, for example, the poverty levels that
All right, we've just lost the doctor, but luckily we got explanations for most of those questions. And yet Justice, he says, would be giving real commitment, giving real compensation to nations like our own, many African nations that in a sense are the victims of climate change, but also now have to deal with the whole push to reduce emissions. That was Climate Justice Project Manager at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation SA, Dr Roland Ngam.